Good evening. I'm Mary Pat Higgins, President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. Thank you all so much for joining us for tonight's program, Religion and Genocide. I'd like to start by thanking our community partners for this program: AJC Dallas, Jewish Family Service of Greater Dallas, Legacy Senior Communities, Mosaic Family Services, Refugee Services of Texas, Southwest Jewish Congress, and the Texas Holocaust, Genocide, and Anti-Semitism Advisory Commission. We sincerely appreciate your support of the museum and its programs. I'd like to also give a special welcome to our museum members, board members, and volunteers joining us this evening. Thank you so much for your continued support of the museum. We could not put on programs like this one without you. If you're watching tonight and you are not a member or a volunteer, I encourage you to visit our website, www.dhrm.org, to learn more. We'd love to have you join our member family. We present tonight's program as part of our permanent exhibition highlight series, which expands upon topics and themes featured in the museum. If you have not yet had a chance to visit the museum, I invite you to do so, and I encourage you to explore our 10 Stages of Genocide gallery, where you can learn more about some of the genocides that we will be discussing during the program. We are honored to have such an esteemed panel of experts with us tonight. Before we get started, I would like to introduce them briefly. Dr. Stephen Leonard Jacobs is a professor of religious studies and Emeritus Aaron Aronoff Chair of Judaic Studies at the University of Alabama. An ordained rabbi, Dr. Jacobs' research focuses primarily on biblical studies in the areas of translation and interpretation, as well as Holocaust and genocide studies. He is the author of several books, including the upcoming Religion and Genocide, Changing Conversation. Dr. Timothy P. Longman is a professor of political science and international relations, director of the Institute on Culture, Religion, and World Affairs, and the director ad interim of the African Studies Center in the Pardee School at Boston University. His research focuses on state-society relations in Africa, and his published works include Memory and Justice in Post-Genocide Rwanda and Christianity and Genocide in Rwanda. And Dr. Kate E. Timoney, a former Assistant Dean of Students and currently an Assistant Professor of Religion at Montclair State University. She is the co-chair of the Religion, Holocaust, and Genocide Unit of the American Academy of Religion and a co-founder of the Genocide Education and Prevention Project. Dr. Timoney's international publications and presentations address the intersection of religion, human rights, and mass atrocities. Our moderator tonight is Dr. Sarah Abosh Jacobson, Barbara Rabin, Chief Education Officer at the museum. An experienced educator, Sarah has researched, taught, and written on Jewish culture and history. She regularly speaks on the Holocaust, topics in Jewish history and culture, and the history covered in the museum's core and special exhibitions. We'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end of the program, so please use the Q&A button located at the bottom of the screen and type them out, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible. And now I'd like to turn the evening over to our esteemed panel. Sarah?
Thank you so much, Mary Pat. And thank you, Dr. Jacobs, Dr. Longman, and Dr. Timoney for joining us. I hope you don't mind, in the interest of having just a comfortable conversation amongst colleagues, I will use first names, and please address me as Sarah. So I'm very excited about this conversation. And I wanted to start by asking each of you, and the order we'll go in is, the order I'm seeing it in my screen. So for this first question, we'll Steve first, Tim second, and Kate third. And what I would like to do is ask each of you to briefly tell us a little bit more about your approach and research that you're currently working on or have been involved in or engaged in during your career related to analyzing the intersection of religion and genocide. So let's set the stage for this evening. And again, we'll begin with Steve.
Okay, thank you. There's a good Hebrew word that we all need to know. It's bekitzer, which means short form.
Mm-hmm.
I am concerned about the intersection between religion and violence. I got started in the field because of my family background. The majority of my family were murdered during the Second World War in the Holocaust, and it was a profoundly religious family, as was explained to me. My father, who was one of only 8 survivors, as I describe it, lost his faith in the camps. He would not even put on a kippah during my growing up years. So I used to daven in an Orthodox synagogue with his great uncle, who maintained his faith. So it was this kind of imbalance that really piqued my interest. And I continued to delve into the religio-theological aspects of the Holocaust. And it led me, I think, quasi-naturally to a discussion of religion, violence, and genocide by expansion. So it really is from religion and violence in the Holocaust to religion and violence in the various genocides throughout history.
So it's a different and more religious variant of a Lemkin entree into the field. Very interesting.
Very.
Okay, Timothy.
I traveled to Rwanda in 1992 to do my dissertation research on, at the time it was on religion and democratization. There was a democracy movement that was going on. And I arrived in Rwanda at a time of great optimism when people thought there was going to be a political transition. And during the year that I was there, I watched the country move towards genocide. So I saw the population being pushed more and more to be divided along ethnic lines, and scapegoating of the ethnic Tutsi, the minority group. And as I was studying the churches, I found that the churches got caught up in that very much. There was a big disagreement within the churches there over whether they should be fighting for human rights and standing up for the oppressed, or the majority view of those in power was to support the powerful. And that led them to really back up the politicians who were pushing ethnic hatred and ethnic division. About 11 months after I left Rwanda, the genocide against the Tutsi took place. And then I went back the year after as the director of the Human Rights Watch office there. It's one of these things where I sort of stumbled into the topic. I had studied African politics and studied Rwanda, and ended up having to learn about genocide and human rights because of what I saw take place there. And as I was, after spending these 2 years in Rwanda, one before the genocide and one after, as I struggled to try to make sense of the horrible things that had happened in many times to people that I knew, sometimes carried out by people that I knew, it helped to look at other cases as well. So I familiarized myself with the Armenian genocide, the Holocaust, what was going on in the former Yugoslavia, and other cases around the world, to try to understand how this case compared, and ways that it was similar and ways that it was different. So that's kind of how I got started on this path, and ultimately wrote a book about the churches and the genocide in Rwanda.
Okay, very interesting. And Kate.
Yes. So thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I'm really happy to have this opportunity to share a screen with Steve and with Tim, and to be able to talk to all of you out there who are spending your evening with us. And so, yeah, the way that I started is I'm trained as a comparative religious ethicist. So that's my training. And I came into the study of religious ethics actually looking at warfare and just war theory. And so one thing that many of your audience members may know is that genocides often happen alongside wars. So as I was studying just war and learning more about genocide and about human rights more generally, genocide being a human rights violation, I realized that there really weren't a lot of religion scholars that were engaged in this kind of work, despite the fact that often conflicts would have some kind of religious component. And so just as Tim said, when you stumble into something, I also realized, wow, like this is something that I, as a comparative religious ethicist, might have something to say about. And so the way in which that trajectory has unfolded for me is kind of in three ways. One is in looking theoretically, again, because I'm trained as an ethicist, is looking theoretically at different cases, quote unquote, so conflicts that we've typically deemed as canonically, as genocides, and looking at those and then trying to look at religious feature and comparatively see where there might be some similarities and where there might be some differences, and how that might be helpful to us in not only understanding how religious ideology and actors and institutions are involved in the different phases, because genocide's a process. So like in those prodromal phases, right, things, when things are just kind of looking like they're kind of going wrong, to like an actual eruption of violence, which is typically how we think of genocide, even though it could mean other things other than mass killing. That's typically how people have equated it with mass killing. And then of course, post-genocide, how religious actors involved. So my research is really focused on that. And that area, interestingly, has most practically been helpful to those who have come to me, like say the State Department or different think tanks or different institutions who have come and asked me to speak, are interested in that theoretical part so far as how it might practically intervene and how religious actors might be involved in prevention. Then the second part of my research has focused on looking at not phenomenologically how religion and genocide intersect on the ground, how the dynamic between them, but as a field, where have we seen religious studies involved in this larger field of genocide studies? And so I've written a couple of pieces about that. And then the third is that despite the fact that the three of us here have these careers that are looking at this phenomenon, it's also statistically rare. And so the third part of my work, and this has been maybe the 2 or 3 pieces I've most recently published, have been looking at how can looking at religion and genocide within other contexts also be helpful to us. So I've looked at it within the context of white nationalism in the United States. And I've looked at it within the context of a discussion about moral injury. I've looked at it, and so looking at in several contexts how talking about religion and genocide could be helpful in other areas has been a third part of my research.
Okay, wonderful. Again, I'm so pleased that we have this panel together and listening to the 3 different areas that each of you focus on. You will each inform the other and us in terms of how this goes. So on this question, I'm going to go Kate, and then Timothy, and then Steve. And the reason I want to come back to you, Kate, is because I think it applies to what you were just talking about very, very directly. So for many people, and the United States is certainly no exception to this, religion is really a big part of their identity. It dictates their values, their beliefs, and in many ways, it even helps form a way of life for them, guiding them on kind of in their daily interactions and in their daily behavior. In what ways can religious institutions and their believers impact their broader communities outside of their religion? For instance, laws, social structures, cultural movements. Can you talk about that a bit, please?
Sure. So briefly, I guess I could say a couple of things about that. So one is that when we look at civil society, so oftentimes, although not always, there's a state apparatus that's involved in genocide perpetration. So if we're talking about non-governmental, so civil society, a very influential part of that are institutions that are religiously affiliated. So whether that be non-governmental organizations and and advocacy groups that have a religious kind of bend, or whether that be religious institutions themselves. And so oftentimes they can be very vocal in helping with situations of triggers, or issues of scarcity, or issues of enmity, right? So in helping build what we call resilient, kind of genocide resilient or mass atrocity resilient societies. So helping address those issues that can often cause or foment problems, which can be anything from economic gaps, right, to land disputes, right? So the ways in which maybe civil society can help fill those gaps can sometimes be very helpful. Another way in which it can be very helpful is when it comes to, and this typically is post-genocide, our reconciliation and transition efforts. But the reason why I say that so far as, like, say, prevention or involved in genocide is that oftentimes one of the ways in which we might be concerned about an eruption of violence is that there may have been a prior event of violence. So how one conflict is then handled can often make a big difference as to whether there may be another outbreak. And we see that religious actors are increasingly more involved in transitional justice kind of programs in ways that we haven't seen before. And then last, I guess, is just when it comes to interfaith, and this is probably the one that most poignantly answers your question, are things like inter and intra-faith dialogues that happen amongst communities as a way of, again, building those genocide resilient societies, but also in educating each other, right? Just being aware of what's going on with your governments and aware of the issues that are surrounding you and your community, because religious communities tend to be intact, right? In the sense you have large groups of people that can be reached quickly and that have influential and often moral sway. So being a part of that group and being in tune and then mobilizing yourselves in ways that you think are helpful is also another way, I think.
Okay. Timothy, I'd like to talk to you also about, the ways in which religious institutions and their believers can impact their broader community. And I would like to follow up on something that Kate just mentioned, which is this notion of inter and intra-religious dialogue. And again, this is not my area of expertise, but it strikes me that that is a very American approach or a Western European approach. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's a bad approach, because we'll take anything that helps us kind of solve some of these problems. But can you speak a little bit to that? And is that realistic in a place like Rwanda, in some of the other areas that you studied? I'm curious.
I mean, one of the things about religion is it can play a variety of different roles. Kate has actually written really well about this, sort of categorizing different positions that religion can take. It can be an identifier. So in some cases, the religious identity of people is used as a reason to target them. So the Christian Armenians and Jews weren't killed primarily because of their faith, but religion was one of the aspects that was used to set them apart. It's not always the case. In Rwanda, the people were all Christian, mostly, different varieties of Christian denominations, but they cut across ethnic lines. But in pretty much every case, religious institutions play a really important role in helping to establish moral standards in the society, or at least people turn to their religion. And that's where the interaction with the state and with the society becomes really important, because when religious leaders speak out against violence, when they speak out in defense of the defenseless, it can be something that helps to stop violence. When they encourage the divisions, it can be something that really adds fuel to the fire. In Africa, it's the place where Christianity and Islam come together most. There's a lot of countries that have both communities. Some are equally divided. Some have a Christian minority, some have a Muslim minority. And the attitudes that religious leaders take really is quite important. In general, actually, Christians and Muslims get along quite well in Africa. There's very little conflict. The cases of conflict make a lot of news, but they're the exceptions. And it's largely because the religious leaders on both sides have decided that working together and supporting people, even if they're of a different faith, is important. And so I think that's an interesting example that in Africa, as elsewhere, there are lots of opportunities to work across lines of faith and to bring people together who have diverse ideas.
Okay. Steve, would you like to add anything to this?
Yes. One, I appreciate both Tim's and Kate's comments. I want to throw a different slant on this, because what has been thus far articulated is the positive.
Mm-hmm.
The negative has to address the issues of power and collusion. And I think the history not only of Western civilization, but when we turn to religions, the need to maintain institutional power comes into the conversation. And that's the downside. religious leaders throughout history have from my perspective, a notoriously bad record in supporting authoritarian regimes because it was one of the ways in which they could maintain power. And I think that's the other side of the equation. I agree that the potential of religious leadership and followership to cross boundaries, cross lines for the sustenance and sustaining of community is great. But from a historical perspective, I think that is rarer. Perhaps
Steve,
yeah,
we're
that's
losing you.
am I still there?
We don't see you, but we hear you. Yes.
Okay, yes, that's my Alabama is set up for emergency alerts for child abduction and other things. I'm part of that network, so that was what that was all about. But again, Tim, I appreciate what you're saying in a positive way, but as a historian, that's my background and training. I tend to look at these issues of power and collusion on the level of leadership, institutional leadership. And the other element I want to throw into the discussion is religio-theological justification for the maintaining of power and political support. So I think to complete the conversation, we have to address both elements.
Yeah, and as I was trying to say, it's religious leaders can take both positions. But I agree with you that it's much more common that religious groups actually support whoever's in power, and that's often authoritarian regimes, and often regimes that carry out human rights abuses and atrocities.
Yeah, and much of the writing that I've actually done has actually been on the involvement of religious ideology actors and institutions in actually committing genocide, because that is more common. But so far, it's like for your listening audience, people who are religious are thinking about like, how can we as religious communities mobilize and actually intervene or actually be positive actors, given the fact that this is a rare occurrence, but how can we still, so far as relating to your audience, how they might be involved, I think that's the positive parts of that, I think, speak to that. But Steve is absolutely right, as is Tim, that unfortunately, and this is Samantha Powers has written about this, is that unfortunately, religion tends to be on the wrong side of history when it comes to violence and perpetration of violence.
Okay, the next question order that we're going to go in is we'll go with Steve first, and it'll be very clear in just a minute as to why, and then Kate second and Tim third, just to switch up our order. So Steve, starting with you, when you look at a genocide like the Holocaust, it's clear that religion was an important factor in the marking of Jews as the main victim group. Now, we know that the Nazis conflated religion and ethnicity with race, and that was deliberate on their part, and that it was wrong, but this is how they did it. Historically, you're the historian, how often have we seen religion play a role in genocide, whether it's positive or negative, and how it can actually drive state actors, I guess is what I'm getting at as well.
I like to think positively, but when I survey history, I would put on the table for the discussion for our audience, for my colleagues, my understanding as a historian is that in very, very rare, unusual cases, as exceptions to the rule, religions, however we define and understand them institutionally, religio-theologically, have been participating factors throughout human history, leaderships and followerships, using their commitment to religion. You pick the examples. Kate mentioned some of her writing. Ben Kiernan at Yale and colleagues will soon be publishing a 3-volume Cambridge history of genocide. I have a contribution in there called the Religion Genocide Nexus. And in my contribution is a chart, 3 pages, examining genocides throughout history. And what is interesting is that in the entire chart, it's about 40 to 50 different genocides. There are only 3 exceptions where religion does not seem to be a factor. So I think, you know, the Holocaust is problematic on many levels, but please don't forget, and Sarah, you're probably as familiar with it as we are, Bishop Mueller was designated as Reich Bishop of what we call in English the Nazi Christian Church.
Mhm.
Now, that's absurd linguistically. How can Nazism and Christianity coexist? But evidently it did in the minds of many. And again, I don't want to focus too much, but the reality of the Second World War, we have to keep in mind that not all of those who participated in the perpetrators' work rejected their religion. We know that, for example, there were many chaplains. Doris Bergen at Toronto has dealt with this issue. There were chaplains in the Wehrmacht. How is this possible? That's the question that keeps me up at night. What is this marriage between religious affirmation and genocidal violence? And I would argue or suggest that it is historically present. Now, maybe that'll trigger another question later on, but my baseline proposition in the book that hopefully will be out before the end of the year, my argument is that religion by definition is a flawed social construct. It is a flawed human creation, and there are parallels between its creation and those who actually do the work of genocide. So I see it in a very dark way, despite the smile.
Very interesting. Just as a follow-up question to that, does any of that shake your connection to your faith?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yes.
I like an honest answer. That's
Mhm.
that's good. Okay, Kate.
Sure, yes, I'll just answer very briefly. So the question is about what role what role religion plays in genocide. And in the way in which the question was framed, it seems to go toward the perpetration of genocide, as opposed to like generally what kind of role in giving the example of the Jewish population being targeted. So if we say more specifically the role in fomenting or in potentiating violence, then like as Steve mentioned, it's often been a participating factor in egging on or instigating it, and it often is not the sole overriding reason either. So oftentimes we see it paired with other issues. It's rare that religion difference in and of itself is the reason why some kind of genocidal violence breaks out. It's often attended by something else, but the role that it can play can be that it could be one of potentiating violence or intensifying it or lending legitimacy to language, to making the unthinkable thinkable. Right? There are all sorts of ways in which religion kind of abets genocide, but it also has other roles. And as Tim pointed out, even in the cases where religion is a factor, it doesn't necessarily have to be religious difference. That's the factor, which is what Tim's work has really done a great job of elucidating for us. So it might come out later, but yeah, other roles other than actually kind of intensifying or participating in genocide include things like what were mentioned before. You know, it can also play a role in reconciliation. There also is rescue behavior that sometimes happens. It's not that common, believe it or not, but sometimes people are religiously motivated to engage in rescue behavior or to hide people. And then of course, again, you have post-genocide. You often have religious actors involved in that too. But for the sake of time, I'll defer to Tim.
Tim.
Unless you have a follow-up question there, Sarah.
Well, the one thing that working with the Holocaust that's always been interesting to me is that there were those types of religious actors who went above and beyond at the risk of their lives to save Jews, but some of them, after they saved Jews, particularly if they were Jewish children, if they had raised them as Christian for the years in which they had them in their care, fought to keep from turning them back to surviving family members. And that's a problematic all of its own, because they did the right thing, but then they do the wrong thing. I mean, it's very, very interesting. It's complicated.
Yeah, and I think the quick thing I'll say about that, because I think what you said is really important, is that one thing that we've tried to move beyond as well in genocide studies is looking at people purely as victims or people purely as perpetrators.
Exactly.
Because as you just mentioned, people, you know, it could be any gradation, along the way of how they might choose at one point to be, to participate and not. So I think that's a really important point that you made.
One of the things that I think is important is to not view religious communities as monolithic, because they're actually multivocal, and there are often very important debates and struggles going on within religious institutions themselves regarding how they should react to other parts of the society, how they should relate to the state, how they should relate to various marginalized groups in their societies, and often there are people within religious institutions who are very closely tied to politicians. They will have gone to school together. They tend to run in the same class circles and maybe very closely tied together. But there are other people within the same religions who will challenge that. What I saw in Rwanda was that there was a major struggle that was going on that mirrored the struggle for democracy that was going on in the political sphere. And in both cases, those advocating a progressive voice lost. And so in part, when religious leaders ended up endorsing the genocide in Rwanda, they used it to strengthen their own power against some of the people in the church themselves. But it wasn't a foregone conclusion. I myself would push back against the idea that religion is always on the side of the powerful and on the side of violence, because I think actually religions are quite diverse and people take them in different directions. The question that I struggle with is, why is it that the side of the powerful usually wins? It doesn't always, but there are lots of people who are inspired by their religion to try to challenge that. And there's interesting work that's been done, for example, by Scott Strauss, who's at the University of California, Berkeley, on genocides that didn't happen, and looking at cases where, in fact, genocide was not, could have happened. It looked like there were some of the factors, but in the end, it didn't take place. And he doesn't actually focus on religion in that, but I think that's something that our own research could look at. Have religious institutions played a role in helping to stop cases of mass atrocity from happening when they were potential?
Yeah, another person along with Scott Strauss is McLaughlin, has also done a piece on structural violence, where again, he looks at situations where genocides did not happen, but all the triggers were there, or all the forecasting elements were there. And as you mentioned, and there have been some cases where they thought religion might have made a difference. But one last quick point I'll make, because we might talk about this later, is we might actually at some point also talk about ethno-religious identities, which also has a very interesting element in all of this.
Noted. For this question, I'd like to go in the order of Tim, Steve, and Kate. And Tim, because of what you were just talking about, can you elaborate a little bit? We're using, because this is what we use in our 10 stages of gallery, 10 stages of genocide gallery at the museum. We use Greg Stanton's model. So could you talk a little bit about religious institutions and what roles they can play in the early stages of genocide? So classification, symbolization, discrimination, and obviously they can go either way. They can ramp things up. They can help to tamp things down. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, religious leaders can play a role in helping to divide societies. They can really emphasize the degree to which their people feel persecuted. One one of the common factors in genocides across the globe is a sense by those who carry out mass atrocities that they're actually defending themselves. An idea that it is to protect their own communities that they have to preemptively attack other people, which is why when I see some of the things happening in the United States these days, I get frightened, because I think there's a lot of that kind of language of we're in danger and have to protect ourselves. Religious leaders play a really big role in helping to influence that. They can help to stoke that and make people feel like they're persecuted and that they need to defend themselves, and to alienate them from other people in their communities, so that people who end up becoming targets for the violence, or they can encourage people to see their common humanity. And it really is, as I mentioned, in Africa, there's a lot of potential for Muslim-Christian conflict, but there really isn't that much Muslim-Christian conflict, largely because there are a lot of leaders who choose to talk across lines. But in some places where it does happen, it's because leaders are dividing their communities from one another and emphasizing their differences and encouraging fear, and then giving that some moral backing and saying that you have God on your side and that you have the moral position, and that those people are the people who are immoral and who are bad, and therefore it ends up justifying violence. So religion is really one of the things that it rarely is the main cause for violence that takes place, but it allows people to carry out violence. If they feel that there's moral justification for what they're doing, if they feel that their religious leaders have their back, then it gives them the courage to actually act in ways that they might not otherwise.
There are 2 points that I'd like to just briefly make, because this is not about me, it's about all of you, but you've mentioned a few times Africa, and I just want to kind of point out, and I know you know this, that you're really discussing sub-Saharan Africa, because Saharan Africa takes a much more conflict-laden approach to religious interactions. And the other thing that I would point out about this is, we can't let Europe off the hook, which is that there's 2 millennia of the planting of certain Christian religious seeds that undergird the entire kind of civilizational experiment that becomes what we know as modern Europe, that for a whole series of reasons obviously comes to explosive levels, with the rise of Hitler and other ideologies. So just to make this a little more problematized than we've been discussing it. Okay, Steve, would you like to add, please?
Yeah, you're going to find among the 3 of us no disagreements, for sure. Yeah. I think we're all pretty much on the same page. Religions as human social cultural constructs possess certain perspectives that open the doors to the very kinds of things that we're talking about. For example, I think Kate and Tim and I would reject this whole concept, which was very popular early on, of essentialism. What are the essentials of religion? What are the essential elements of these things? But when you look at religions, you have to address such things as tribalism, us versus them, privileged access to the divine, a literature which values us. All of these are contributory factors that open the door to genocides. You may or not know that when Greg, my good friend Greg Stanton, originally put his stages or steps on of genocide, it was 8 steps. Mm-hmm. Since then, he's expanded it. I talked to Greg for permission to include his now 10 stages of genocide in my forthcoming book. I think you can rewrite every stage that Greg presents in his sequence in religion. The use of symbols, the use of propaganda, singling out. All of these things are common in both arenas. That's kind of where my focus is on this, answering your question, that the parallels, and Tim, I think we could probably have a very explosive political discussion in light of what is going on in this country at this moment. But the parallels are ominous. The parallels between political agendas and religious agendas, they line up, or political agendas, religious agendas, genocidal agendas. And it's not a stretch of mine or anyone else's imagination that they do line up. And that may open the door to a conversation that would keep us here well after midnight. And that's where I get uncomfortable. How easy it is for political leaders and religious leaders, both of whom have genocidal agendas, to really collude with each other. It's too easy. It's too easy. And that should give all of us pause, I would think.
Kate?
Sure, yes, I'll answer that briefly. So one is that there actually is, and this is part of when I talk about the practical application of some of the theory that I engage in, and much of this theorizing I've also done because Tim and Steve's work has been so helpful, is that the United Nations actually in 2017 released a document called the Plan of Action for Religious Leaders and Actors to Prevent Incitement to Violence that could lead to atrocity crimes. And so you have a very pointed document that was put together that I actually wrote a piece about, trying to assess, like how well some of what they wrote lines up with my research. And in that, they break it out into 3 areas. So can they help build these kind of genocide resilient communities? Can they engage in prevention through things like intra and inter-religious dialogue, things like countering violence against women, because oftentimes we often see sexual violence as a component of genocides, and then sometimes religion can also be involved in that. And then also in looking at strengthening networks amongst different people, so you can raise the alarm, for instance, if you see something happening. And so you actually have this UN document that specifically targets religious leaders. Now, oftentimes these religious leaders may not be women, right? So this is another issue that often comes up. But to go to Tim and to Steve's point is that we often see religious leaders involved in, as was mentioned earlier, in this othering, right? So you have these religious communities that then, because they have that kind of moral sway with their members, that people fall outside. And I think Steve even uses this language as well, like they fall outside the circle of moral regard, right? Like they become people that are so othered that there's certain acts that are authorized against them. And then you have this justification, which is what Tim was also talking about earlier, when you kind of make the thinkable, the unthinkable thinkable, right? All of a sudden now there are things that you can do in the name of religion that didn't otherwise seem to be possible. And then, so that can be a kind of authorization, and you kind of have like a justification, right? This sense that there's like a mortal as well as maybe even otherworldly threat that a certain group of people pose to us that means that their extirpation, isn't justified, right? So leaders often play a role in then having any of those 3 particular lenses move forward. The last thing that I'll say, and this is based on your comment about the seeds of like imperialism and the expansion of Western Europe as we understand it, is that there's a great book called Exterminate All the Brutes, which is by Lindquist, that traces that out. It's actually a travelogue where he looks at the very ways in which we still see legacies of colonialism literally embedded in the landscape. And that travelogue is alongside his kind of recounting of how we can see that the genocide that we see that happened in Europe, that was a part and parcel of in some ways marriages between like religion and science, leading up to the extermination of the brutes. And then it links the Holocaust then to colonialism and to imperialism. But then the last point I'll make is that Raoul Peck, who is a Haitian director who directed a film called I'm Not Your Negro, which some of your audience members may be familiar with. He has an HBO docu-series that just came out, I think this past year, that takes that title, Exterminate All the Brutes, where he specifically links colonialism, imperialism, religion to the Holocaust, to the extermination of Native peoples in Australia and the United States, and then also to American slavery. So he has this really interesting thread that he also tries to but it's a very accessible, dare I say, entertaining docu-series that your audience members might be interested in. It's an HBO docu-series.
Okay. All right, let's go this time with Kate first, Steve second, Tim third. So in your research, have you identified instances where religious institutions or leaders ignore or promote genocidal actions? And it's not that they don't do this, but what drives them to do this? So it's much more common and I think easier for us to understand what would drive them to try and shut this down. But what are the drivers to get them to actually act in this fashion?
Oh, so why would religious institutions and actors go along with a genocidal campaign?
Well, not just go along with it, sometimes actually promote it. I mean,
Yeah.
work within their religious framework to further it.
Right. So this goes to 10 points. And the reason why I say go along with is because typically religious actors aren't the ones that initiate it. Right. So typically it's a like it's a state actor, and typically it's a state apparatus, and it's not religious difference. So the religious communities alone that are actually launching it. And so, yeah, so my understanding is, along with Tim's understanding, is that it's and I think Steve said this earlier too, is a preservation of their own power. So one of the things that we see, and this again goes back to that is very helpful to look at places where genocides do not happen, as a way of trying to work with prevention, is that McLaughlin and Strauss and others had identified that, and this is also a work by Philpott, who does work on transitional justice and on religious actors involved in transitional justice. One of the things that all of those things found in common is that if you have religious institutions that have some sense of autonomy or some sense of separation from the state, that you're less likely to have something like a genocide happen. And so typically the reason why you might see, if you see a really close relationship, we see this in Serbia, right, between the Serbian Orthodox Church, for instance, and the Milosevic regime. You saw this in some ways, with the colonial enterprise in Rwanda, right, where you see religious institutions are closely affiliated and invested in the state, that they also have a certain power that they want to maintain. In the case of the Holocaust, we saw, for instance, Holy Silence was a documentary that came out about the Catholic Church specifically. We've also seen a lot of work about Protestant churches. And of course, we know the Vatican Archives, Pope Pius XII and his letters recently opened, and now people may or may not find any more new information there. They're the reason why the Catholic Church, for instance, didn't have a more full-throated kind of rejection, was because of fear of communism, right? So they had a fear, of communism, and so they felt as though part of protecting the church and protecting the saved, right, was to go along with what was happening and to remain silent. But you do have some cases, like in Rwanda, where people actively participated, like you said, Sarah, where people have actually gone, there've been tribunals, right, where nuns and priests have been found guilty of participating in genocide. But it's very common that it's either people are bystanders, they don't do anything, or they might have a full-throated endorsement, or they might actually actively participate.
Okay. Steve, I don't mean to depress you, but can you share some examples from your work? And I mean, obviously the Holocaust is the gorilla in the room.
Well, there's a book that I found, which really never got the press that it ought. It's a book called Administrative Evil.
Mm-hmm.
Talks about bureaucracy and bureaucratic organization. I think actually it had nothing to do with genocide or history. It's a book from the world of business. And yet I found it insightful when it comes to the way in which people, once they fall into the niche of the bureaucracy, strive to maintain their own justifications, their own actions. Religions, again, it almost sounds repetitive, as institutions have the overwhelming need to justify themselves and to maintain their institutional power. And I don't think we should ever minimize what that means, because one of the things that was stressed in the book Administrative Evil is that justification leads to decision making. And that, I think, is a key insight, at least for me. Germany, Rwanda, the Turks, the CUP, vis-a-vis the Armenians, the desire for nationhood, all of these factors, but it's a justification. And then you have to boil it down to individuals. And that's where I think psychology gets involved in this, because one thing we haven't talked about is the role, purpose, and function of religion as on an individual basis. One of the things that is part and parcel of the human journey, it seems to me, that religion, institutionally, leaderships, rituals, symbols, worship, the whole Geschichte, the whole patterning, is to make sense of the world. When I was in graduate school, I'll never forget, and with that I'll stop. One of my teachers once defined religion as the attempt to make sense of the world so that we can get through the day, because it's a very frightening place in which we live. So religion offers us the opportunity to make sense, and so we can function. And if that functioning means denigrating others, colluding with power, privileged access to the sacred, we're going to do it, because the goal is to get through the day.
Tim?
I'm writing a book right now on church and state across Africa. And what I'm exploring in that book is why are there some rare exceptions where Christian leaders stand up against the state and challenge it? And looking at the scope of history, it is pretty rare. In answer to the question of why do religious leaders get caught up in something like genocide? Well, it's often because going along with the state is easier. It opens doors. Challenging the state, challenging leaders, standing up for the right, being prophetic is much harder. Religious leaders face pushback. It makes it harder for them to run their institutions. They will lose adherents because they take these positions. And so when you have people who are promoting division and promoting violence, it's easier to go along with it rather than challenging things. And it's a sad reality that religions, rather than shaping societies, often reflect them. In rare occasions, that's not true. And in rare occasions, you get somebody like Desmond Tutu and the churches in South Africa that stand up against the apartheid state. You get people like the Dalai Lama who stand up, and call for peaceful transition and stand for human rights. But those are the exceptions, and it's got a lot to do with power. I'm a political scientist, right? And so my understanding of religion is as an inherent, religious institutions are inherently political, not just because they deal with the state, but because of their own internal politics where they fight about things and struggle. And unfortunately, the easy way out is usually to go along with the dominant society and with the state. And even if the states are carrying out terrible things like planning for genocide, religious leaders often end up giving it backing because of that.
If I could just add one other thing to what you just said, Tim. The other is the human factor, the cost. You could lose your life in the process. Yeah. And I'm thinking of Oscar Romero in South. Yep. It's a great example of standing up to power. It's not so much speaking truth to power, but the ability to survive after you have spoken such truth. And Romero didn't survive, and the Dalai Lama had to flee.
Yep.
I mean, so there's a human cost to courage, even based on faith. You could die, and if you die, your voice dies with you.
Yeah. So the next question I'd like to ask was something that was brought to mind by Kate. So we'll start with Kate, and then we'll move to Tim and then to Steve. Kate, can you talk about ethno-religious identity and a couple of things? Can you first please define it, just very, very basically for our audience, and then can you give some examples of how ethno-religious identity as opposed to purely religious identity can make this a much more problematical or difficult issue to kind of pick apart and address when it comes to genocide.
Sure, yeah, and in the interest of time, I'll be as brief as possible. So it sounds like what it sounds like, in the sense that it's a person's or group's ethnicity gets grafted onto, or vice versa, right, or religious identity, and they become fused. And one of the reasons why this can be very sticky, one of the probably most obvious parts would be that you can't be saved through conversion, right? So the sense is that if a perpetrator group is targeting a particular group for destruction, and then if you have an ethno-religious identity, it's not as though you can just switch and convert, to another religion, because we see this probably most saliently in the Bosnian genocide with Serbia, where being a Serb meant that you were Christian, which meant that if you were Muslim, that you somehow couldn't be saved through conversion to Christianity because they were incapable of actually becoming Christians, or incapable of that. And so, so the ethno-religious identity then really makes it, the group that's being targeted inescapable from that particular targeting, because it's not like they can just convert. It also is a way of, and this is something that Grace Davey, I think, says really well, DAVIE, in talking about one of the ways in which we've seen religion kind of changing, is that you can basically, you don't have to actually believe to belong, in the sense that you have plenty of people who don't actually believe in the tenets of a particular religious tradition, but they identify with it culturally. So that also can be another way of thinking about how this can be a very difficult idea to pick apart, because as we've seen with people like Larry May and Chavez, who are lawyers, they would say, well, most people say, well, what's the big deal, right? Can't you just convert? And they're like, well, no, these are not traditions that people easily leave, right? Even though people from a Western perspective might think, well, why can't you just convert to another religion or be a different religion? So it can be a real powder keg when it comes to trying to underline nationalism, right? In the sense of part of what it means to be a part of this community is to be a part of this ethnicity and this religion, which by definition means that some people never can be accepted fully into the polity.
Okay, the racialization of the Jews.
Right.
Yeah, but I guess what I would say, though, is that to say they never can be is probably too much, because we have a lot of different ways in which we're identified, and they rise and fall in political salience given the circumstances. And so, there was a long period in which in the former Yugoslavia, people lived at peace across these lines. And then it built towards the violence that took place. And then we're trying to think about how to move away from it. So I don't think just because people have multiple identifiers attached to them doesn't mean that those will always be as important as they are at a particular time. So I think in the name of looking for some hope in the future, I think the truth is that sometimes violence diminishes. It's hard once the genie's out of the bottle. It's hard to pull back from it, but it is possible for identities that once were something people would fight and die for to become actually less important. The identities are still there. The country next to Rwanda, Burundi, is a country that I've studied where they also have Hutu and Tutsi, and there was a civil war that was largely based on ethnicity. And the country has a lot of problems. It's authoritarian, but because of a number of policies that were put into place there, the Hutu-Tutsi divide is not nearly as important as it used to be. It's diminished quite a bit. And so I think one of the things as we're talking about religion is realizing that while religious leaders often end up endorsing violence and endorsing divisions, they can play a role in helping pull us back from the brink and actually working together across lines of ethnicity or religion or other things and coming together. So it's not a foregone conclusion that just because you have divisions that they will always be politically important and be a source of violence.
Yeah. And I have no problem with intellectual disagreement, but in this case, I just don't think we are. What I was saying is that that's one of the reasons why it's justified in extirpating the group, right? Yeah. So the propaganda is this group has to go because they will never be a part of our group. I'm not saying that actually is the case. I'm just saying that's part of the propaganda to justify why a group needs to be destroyed. So, but
I don't disagree with you, Kate. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I just, but just to be clear, I have no problem with disagreeing. I just want to make sure that.
Steve, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, just very briefly. In the book that I edited called Confronting Genocide, Paul Moses has the longest essay in the book, and he actually addresses in all of its configurations the issue of ethno-religious identity in the Bosnian genocide. That's exactly what he sees as the central focus of the problem is you cannot divorce your religious identity from your ethnic identity, from your political identity. And he sees it as the interweaving of all the factors. And I think Kate and Tim I'm in agreement. You can't unweave the threads. You just can't do it. If your ethnic identity is central to your religious identity, is part and parcel of your political identity, and they are not, then the conclusion is you have to remove them to the point of extermination, because they will never be part of that. I know we're probably just about out of time, so I think maybe you may want to also think positively, and I agree with both Kate and Tim. If religious leadership and followership and institutional structures and religio-theological understandings can go down the rabbit hole of negativity leading to genocide, it also has that potential to turn the entire process around. I'm not sure that reconciliation could really take place in post-genocidal communities without religious leadership and followership as a public voice. So I think we have to think positives as well.
Okay, what I'd like to do is move to some of our public participants' questions and answers. Well, questions from them, answers from you all. And the first question I would like to ask, which is it's an interesting one. In modern genocides, what roles do the internet and social media play? Because we haven't talked about that at all. And many religious groups have very active web presences, from those that are extremely fundamentalist to those that are extremely kind of modern thinking in their views. They all utilize this. Whoever would like to go first, I'm going to open it up a little bit more. Or I can call. Kate, how about Kate, Steve, Tim?
Sure, yeah. So going back to that UN document from 2017, actually one of the elements that's listed as a recommendation is that religious organizations become more active in their social media campaigns. And one of the reasons why is because they see religious actors, and this goes back to a point that Tim made, can be seen as great kind of moral voices. And so being able to amplify that moral voice through social media and the internet to reach larger swaths of people is seen as a positive way of amplifying the ability to do that.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm not convinced yet that an internet presence or all of the various social media vehicles have the impact that we think they do. I mean, the one study I remind my own students is the first study of student activity on Facebook was 4 to 6 hours a day. So I said to students in one of my seminars, so you spend 4 to 6 hours a day on Facebook at the time, then what? I said, then I go about and do my homework, then I go out with my friends and we do other things. So I'm not convinced yet that an internet presence is as much a directing factor as maybe we think it is, including the negative websites, of which there are hundreds of horrific websites advocating violence, discrimination against women, et cetera, et cetera. I'm somewhat hesitant to draw that conclusion at this moment.
Okay. Here is another question, and it's one that comes up. We'll go for about another 10 minutes. So it's one that comes up in the context of some of what you've been discussing, which is, where does mankind go from here? I mean, do you think that there are ways to approach religion or to use religion as a religious adherent to give mankind hope, for something better, not just in the afterlife, but here in the here and now?
Um, uh, Religion, for me personally, as someone who's a person of faith, is something that is one thing that gives me hope in the face of the violence and despair that I see around me. I wrote a book that is very critical of what the churches did in Rwanda, and a lot of people have used it to, sort of say, against the churches, and yet I still am an active Christian who participates in a church, because I think, again, religion's not monolithic, and it can inspire. And part of what religion about is in faith in things you don't see, and also that there is this power of community that can be used to transform. I see a lot of religion being used to exclude people and to justify actions that I disapprove of. And I feel like as a person of faith myself, I need to challenge that. And so I don't see the world as being without hope, although there's a lot of darkness, and a lot of things that seem to go wrong. And studying genocide is not one of those things that it's not cocktail conversation that you have at parties. It's some pretty dark stuff. And yet, I do think that when we look for ways out of this, when we look for possible paths away from this life of violence, religion is one of the things that can play a role in that. Unfortunately, it doesn't usually, but it can.
Okay.
I think I draw hope to the degree is finding examples based on experience of dialogue, of people with really different religious orientations able to sit across the table and actually engage in the conversation. And I'll give you one quick example. For 30 years, I was involved in what we used to call, I think we may have changed the title because we haven't met in a while because of COVID, post-Holocaust Midrash group. There were 4 of us that would do these public presentations, 2 of us scholars of Judaism, 2 of us scholars of Christianity. The 2 Christian colleagues were Methodist and Lutheran. And we actually developed this phenomenal friendship where we could actually challenge each other about our basic beliefs and orientation. So if we're talking hope, hope relies on dialogue for me. And I think we need to strengthen all of those possibilities of learning how, as people of faith or religious people, we can talk to each other. And that's where I would go.
Okay.
Sure. I guess 2 quick points. One, and this in some ways actually relates to the social media question, is that, and we certainly see this today, for instance, like with QAnon and with the white nationalism in the United States, is that social media and the internet can be echo chambers, where people just kind of get information to just reinforces what they already think. And so one of the ways in which you can be hopeful about religion is that when that message is a positive one, right? When you are working intra, right? So when you're actually making sure that people within your own communities, if you can lessen the possibility of them radicalizing, right, or lessen the possibility of them being willing to engage in violence, because it's very clear as a community how you act as a community. If you leverage that positivity within a community, that could be a very positive force. And something like, and Tim was mentioning this earlier, something like even communities that have political theologies, right, that they have, if they have a particular way in which they understand the relationship to the state, sometimes that can mean just going along, like Tim was saying, with whatever the state does and just not engaging. But if you have a community or tradition that teaches that there's certain ways in which you intervene on behalf of the weak and the downtrodden, right, that can be a very powerful force. The last quick point I'll make is that it helps us deal with the darkness, right? I mean, and going back to what Tim and what Steve said, is that genocide or any other kind of dark part of humanity that we perpetrate, on ourselves, religion's not monolithic. And so that means that it also has those moments where it can help us through things that are difficult. And that can also be very hopeful.
Okay. One final question, and I do this to end. I hope, and I'll start with Tim, because this speaks to precisely where you did your original dissertation. In what way institutions interact with justice and reconciliation in the aftermath of genocide? I'm thinking of the Kachakas. Can you talk a little bit about the Rwandan case? And please, Kate and Steve, add to this if there's something you want to bring up as well. But this will be our final question. So.
Yeah, the religious groups have to really play an important role in the healing process if it's going to happen. In most countries around the world, religion remains really important to people, and the religious language is something that people are comfortable speaking in. And if you can get religious leaders on board with encouraging dialogue across previous lines of division, then it can make a difference. In Rwanda, there were churches were very reluctant at first to actually take any responsibility for their roles, but there were a lot of grassroots projects that happened in local congregations because people came back together with people who they'd been in conflict with in the past, and dialogues opened, and a lot of churches started reconciliation projects, and ultimately the churches themselves did some soul searching and came forward with their own apologies. Now, the Catholic Church initially denied. Rwanda was about 2/3 Catholic, and there were a lot of people in the Catholic Church who were implicated in the genocide. And the initial reaction from the Vatican was to say this was the sin on the part of individuals. The church bears no responsibility. That the current Pope has come around and come to a position of actually admitting some responsibility for the church and apologizing for the role that the church played in the Rwandan case. And that's really important for healing, because religion is so central in people's lives. If the religious leaders are resisting those difficult conversations, it makes it hard to have them. But if religious leaders are coming forward and saying, our institutions are human and they failed in some cases, and we ask for your forgiveness, I think that opens the door for a lot of more general forgiveness.
Okay. Steve or Kate, is there anything else you'd like to add?
I've mentioned Jewish-Christian dialogical interaction. The other is there are groups throughout the world that are Jewish-German interactions, that is, the children of Holocaust survivors interacting, and I've been part of those groups as well, with actually the children and grandchildren who bear the burden of Nazi predecessors. So that's important. If the children of Holocaust survivors can sit across the table from the children of Nazi perpetrators, if Jews can sit across the table from Christians, then there is positive. And I think religion can serve as a foundational energizer to both conversations.
Okay. Kate, anything to add?
Sure, just quickly here again, I'm just going to completely crib Daniel Philpott, who actually does he actually did like empirical research where he looked at a bunch of cases and the involvement of religious actors in truth and reconciliation commissions. And he found that the ways in which they were most helpful was a point that I mentioned earlier, which is if they had a sense of a political theology, whereby part of their religious community identity was actually being involved in state affairs. The second one was, again, if they were autonomous, right, from the state, if they had some sense of autonomy from the state. But one way in which they were most helpful is in pushing for truth recovery, right? So for instance, like places like Guatemala, where we want to know where our missing ones are. We want to know, whether or not this person actually perpetrated this, like people coming forward. And so we see empirical research that shows that religious actors can be very helpful in those kind of situations. But yes, I underscore what Tim and Steve said so far as issues of apology. And also we often see two last things. One is that religious communities are often involved in relief efforts. So the devastation that happens after a genocide, so far as, refugees, poverty, food, those kinds, they're often very instrumental in helping fill those gaps and in getting assistance to people. But then last, if you actually, and I've only based this on a couple of things that I found, but it's interesting, is that when you often ask communities, even if religion played or religious communities or actors play a significant role in actually fomenting or perpetrating violence, those same peoples from those communities will still say that they feel as though religious actors have a large role to play in helping heal in the healing process. And it's typically not because they feel like they need to apologize for the role they played, right? That can be part of it, but there is a sense that that comfort, right, or that ability to move forward, or that that sense of having a theodicy, right, or a sense of like trying to figure out how to put it all together, that religious actors and communities can play a significant role in that.
All right, I would like to thank all three of you. So Dr. Kate Timony, Dr. Timothy Longman, and Dr. Steve Jacobs, so much for joining us for this really interesting conversation on religion and genocide. And I would like to wish everybody in our audience a good night. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you. Pleasure.